Ever wondered how Poland, a country once ravaged by war and political upheaval, has emerged as one of Europe's fastest-growing economies? This Eastern European nation, with its resilient spirit and resourceful people, is a fascinating study in economic resilience and growth. Poland's economic tale is one of transformation, replete with dramatic twists and turns. At the heart of Europe, Poland has risen from the ashes of its troubled past, growing into a formidable powerhouse that stands out in the European Union. Its economic journey is not just about numbers, but a testament to the indomitable will of a nation determined to rebuild and prosper. So what's the secret recipe behind Poland's economic success? Well, there's no magic potion, but a combination of several key ingredients. Firstly, political stability. Since the fall of communism, Poland has maintained a consistent political climate, fostering economic development and foreign investment. This stability has played a pivotal role in Poland's upward economic trajectory. Secondly, strategic location. Nestled in the heart of Europe, Poland serves as a crucial link between East and West. Its geographical position has enabled it to capitalize on trade opportunities, thereby bolstering its economy. Lastly, a skilled and educated labor force. Poland has consistently prioritized education and skill development, resulting in a workforce that is both competent and versatile. This has not only increased productivity, but also attracted businesses from around the globe. However, it's essential to remember that economic growth is a complex process, influenced by a myriad of factors. These are just some of the elements that have contributed to Poland's economic success. In a nutshell, Poland's economic story is one of resilience, strategic planning, and relentless hard work. It's a testament to the nation's ability to adapt, innovate, and overcome adversity. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the timeline of Poland's economic growth. To understand the miracle of Poland's economy, we must journey back to the pre-1990s era. This was a time when Poland's economy was an enigma, wrapped in the iron curtain of a state-controlled system. It was a period characterized by centrally planned industries, state-owned enterprises, and an absence of free market dynamics. In this state-controlled economy, the government held the reins, deciding what was produced, how much, and at what price. While this might have given a semblance of stability, it came with its own set of challenges. The economic model was not efficient, and it lacked the dynamism and innovation that a competitive market could offer. Consequently, industries often grappled with inefficiencies, leading to a decline in productivity. The system was riddled with bureaucratic red tape, stifling innovation and entrepreneurship. It was an economy that was struggling under the weight of its own constraints, unable to harness the full potential of its resources. Moreover, the Polish economy during this time was heavily reliant on its Eastern Bloc allies for trade. This further compounded the economic challenges faced by the country, as it was often subject to the political whims and economic instability of its trading partners. Towards the late 80s, it became clear that the system was unsustainable. The cracks were beginning to show. There was a growing consensus that a radical overhaul of the economic system was needed. The demand for change was palpable, and the people of Poland were ready for a new economic dawn. The pre-1990s era, thus, was a period of economic stagnation and inefficiency for Poland. But it was also a time of awakening, a realization that change was necessary for the nation to progress. The Polish economy was at a crossroads, and it chose the path of transformation. And so, as the curtain fell on the 80s, Poland stood on the precipice of a new era. The stage was set for a radical transformation, and that's exactly what happened. The 1990s marked the beginning of a new economic era for Poland. As the Iron Curtain fell, Poland found itself at a crossroads, facing the daunting task of transforming its centrally planned economy into one driven by market forces. Enter the economic reforms of the 1990s. The decade witnessed a series of transformative changes that would shape the economic landscape of Poland for years to come. These reforms, often referred to as shock therapy, were swift, comprehensive, and uncompromising. They aimed to dismantle the existing economic structures and replace them with a free market system. The first crucial step was liberalization. Poland's economy was open to the world, breaking down the barriers that had previously isolated it from global markets. The government removed price controls, lifted trade restrictions, and encouraged competition. This allowed Poland to tap into the global economy, attracting foreign investments and boosting exports. The second step was privatization. The government sold off state-owned enterprises to private investors. This move not only helped to reduce the fiscal burden on the state, but also infused these enterprises with fresh capital, managerial expertise, and technological know-how. The result was a more efficient and competitive business sector. The third step was globalization. Poland embraced the global economy with open arms, integrating itself into the world's financial, technological, and cultural networks. This helped to spur innovation, foster entrepreneurship, and increase productivity. Each of these steps was a piece of a larger puzzle, a part of a grand plan to transform Poland's economy. And while the road was not always smooth, with economic hardships and social challenges along the way, the results were nothing short of remarkable. By the end of the 1990s, Poland had successfully transitioned from a stagnant, centrally planned economy to a dynamic, market-driven one. The economy was growing, unemployment was falling, and living standards were rising. These reforms set Poland on a path of unprecedented economic growth. They laid the foundation for the economic powerhouse that Poland has become today, demonstrating the transformative power of economic reform. The dawn of the 21st century saw Poland's economy soaring to new heights. In the beginning of the 2000s, Poland, with its newfound economic freedom, began to truly flourish. A blend of industries emerged as main contributors to this impressive growth, with the service sector, manufacturing, and information technology leading the charge. The service sector, already a dominant player in the 90s, further gained momentum, accounting for over half of Poland's GDP by the mid-2000s. This sector's expansion was largely driven by an increasingly globalized world, pushing Poland to the forefront of European service providers. Manufacturing, too, played a vital role. Poland's strategic location, sandwiched between the booming markets of Western Europe and the emerging markets of Eastern Europe, positioned it as a manufacturing powerhouse. The country's skilled workforce, coupled with comparatively lower labor costs, attracted a slew of multinational companies, boosting the manufacturing sector. The dawn of the digital age brought with it the burgeoning IT industry. Poland's young, educated workforce quickly adapted to this new wave, resulting in a rapidly expanding IT sector. Today, Poland is recognized as a significant player in the global IT landscape, contributing to its robust economic growth. Foreign investment was another crucial element in Poland's economic rise. The country's entry into the European Union in 2004 opened doors to a flood of foreign direct investment. Investors were drawn to Poland's stable economy, strategic location, and competent workforce, injecting much-needed capital into the economy. And then came the 2008 global economic crisis. While economies around the world crumbled, Poland stood resilient. It was the only European Union member to avoid a recession, a feat largely attributed to its diverse economy and prudent fiscal policies. Poland's economic journey since the 2000s is a story of transformation, driven by sectoral growth, foreign investment, and resilience in the face of adversity. Poland's economic story is indeed a testament to the power of reforms and resilience. So what does the future hold for Poland's economy, one might ask? Well, the answer is as multifaceted as the economy itself. Poland's economic potential is vast, driven by a combination of elements such as a highly educated workforce, strategic location in Europe, and a robust domestic market. The country is poised to leverage these assets to attract more foreign direct investment, foster innovation, and further integrate with global value chains. However, like any other economy, Poland also faces challenges. An aging population, the need for further structural reforms, and environmental sustainability are some of the hurdles that the country must overcome to ensure its economic prosperity. Yet, as history has shown us, Poland's resilience and adaptability are nothing short of admirable. With the right policies and strategies, Poland has the potential to transform these challenges into opportunities and continue its upward economic trajectory. Poland's economic journey has been remarkable, but it's far from over. Poland's economic growth is a story of transformation, resilience, and potential. We've taken a deep dive into this fascinating journey, unraveling the enigma from the pre-1990s era, through the significant changes of the 90s and into the remarkable progress made from the 2000s to the present day. Throughout this journey, we've seen Poland's economy stand up to challenges, adapt, and consistently move forward. The country's economic history is a testament to the fact that with strategic planning, resilience, and adaptability, nations can transform their economic landscape. Looking into the future, Poland's economic potential appears promising. The country's well-educated workforce, strategic geographic location, and robust infrastructure, coupled with its commitment to innovation and development, position it for continued growth in the years to come. Thank you for joining us on this journey of Poland's economic growth. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the like button if you found this video insightful. Let's aim for 100 likes for this video.